Our main focus, 99 workers arrested from the Maruti plant, India's largest automaker in Manesar, Haryana.
और जो व्यक्ति भी इस मामले के अंदर शामिल पाया जाएगा, उस पर न केवल जानलेवा हमला करने बल्कि कत्ल का जो मुकदमा है वो हमने दर्ज कर लिया है।
We are not being prosecuted. We are being persecuted.
तो जी हमारे क्या क्या राय होगा हमारा? कोई राय नहीं होता जी। हम तड़प तड़प के बच्चा के मारे तो यही खपाएंगे हम।
जेल में डाल लो इन्हें, जेल में डाल दो, पूरे परिवार को जेल में डाल दो।
Multinational company is involved in it. State is and out for the multinational company.
सबसे बड़ी दिक्कत ये आ रही है कि यहाँ जो राज्य सरकार है ना, वो खड़ी है कंपनी के साथ। राज्य सरकार का काम होता है वैसे एक फेयर ट्रायल कराना, निष्पक्ष होकर कराना। यहाँ पे क्या है, सरकार ने एक ऐसा खड़ा कर दिया है, मिस्टर तुलसी जो है कांग्रेस के वर्कर हैं, एक दिन की फीस क्या 1,85,000।
मैंने पूछा था अपने बेटे से, और बेटे तुम्हारा झगड़ा क्या चल रहा है? वो कह रहे झगड़ा हमारा कोई नहीं आपस में, लेकिन हम इसलिए बोल रहे हैं इनको कि जो कच्चे आदमी कर निकाल देते हैं साल के बाद, 2 साल के बाद, जब परमानेंट होने पाते हैं उनको निकाल देते हैं बेचारे को। तो मैंने भी कहा था बेटे तू छोड़ पड़े, अगर तेरे को नहीं वो कर रहे हैं, मैं तो गरीब की मदद के लिए बनाया हूँ सेक्रेटरी, मैंने भाइयों के लिए बनाया, भाइयों के साथ चलूँगा। अब शादी हुई है, 2 साल हो गए, उसने बहू ने बेचारी खुशी हो गई, कभी खा के देखा।
मेरे में अब बर्दाश्त शक्ति नहीं है, क्योंकि मैंने अपने भाई का गम देखा है, ब्रदर की डेथ हो गई, उसके बाद मैं यही गम नहीं देख सकती। ये हमारी एनिवर्सरी है 7 नवंबर, अब 3 साल हो जाएंगे। साथ नहीं छोड़ूंगी इनका कभी भी, चाहे जो मर्जी हो जाए, साथ नहीं छोड़ूंगी कभी भी।
गोली चलाने वाली सरकार मुर्दाबाद, मुर्दाबाद, मुर्दाबाद। शोषण करना बंद करो, बंद करो, बंद करो।
कहीं पे भी मार्च या उसका जिक्र या आपको अनुमति नहीं दी गई है।
और जब 1.5 साल से हम लगातार लोगों के बीच में हैं और सिर्फ एक मांग कर रहे हैं कि पूरे प्रकरण की एक न्यायिक जांच कराओ और जो गुनहगार है उसको सजा दो,
कैद में डालो, फांसी लगा दो, अंटर से चमड़े भी निकालो। न्याय के रास्ते चल पड़े हैं, कितना जुल्म करेगा जालिम, थक जाना है तुझको, लेकर पिंजरा उड़ जाएंगे, खबर न होगी तुझको।
एक घटना ऐसी भी घटी थी कि एक वर्कर का फॉल्ट गया तो उसको ऑनलाइन स्कूल के बच्चे की तरह मुर्गा बना दिया कि कान पकड़।
बीच बीच में चेक करते थे कि इसके पास मुझे यदि 1 सेकंड का भी टाइम बच रहा है, मान लो बाई चांस, तो इसको और क्या काम दे।
खुला चैलेंज करते थे मैनेजर हमें कि हमने मानेसर प्लांट के लड़कों के मुंह में हाथ फेर के देख लिया, काट नहीं सकते, यहाँ यूनियन नहीं बना सकता कोई। खुला चैलेंज।
पुलिस इज इन दी सर्विस ऑफ द कंपनी। वो जापानीज हॉस्टल है कंपनी का, जापानीज हॉस्टल में पुलिस का क्या काम है?
सारी स्टेटमेंट वही रिकॉर्ड हो रही है।
सच यही है कि बेल क्यों नहीं हो रही, क्यों नहीं हो रही बेल? कोई रीजन है क्या इसका?
सर आज आप 12 बजे का इंतजार कीजिए, आज जो सारे के सारे रास्ते खुल जाएंगे।
इंतजार तो 2 साल से कर रहे हैं, तो 12 तो कोई खास नहीं है, कल के भी 12 बजेंगे।
हाँ जी, क्या हुआ? रिजेक्ट?
बेल रिजेक्ट कर दी गई है।
कि तो फैसला होना चाहिए, तारीख बतारीख, तारीख बतारीख, तारीख बतारीख दे जा। मट्टी खा के पेट भरा क्या?
So it's just that it took all the courts were, even though that was evident and that there were no witnesses against them, the courts were not giving them bail for a long time. And finally, when two of the boys got bail on the argument that they have no witnesses and the prosecution had already produced more than almost 40 witnesses, it's only then that the two bails happened, and then subsequently on that same basis a lot of others got released. But right now 36 are still in jail because they've been identified.
But I mean, in American jurisprudence, bail is not equivalent to a declaration of innocence. Bail is something different.
Yeah, same in India. It's just that the bail is, unless the accused are in a position to actually influence the trial in certain ways. Bail is mostly a right. That's what actually the Supreme Court says. And in India, what's happening increasingly, and this is one of the prime examples, where detention itself is becoming a form of punishment. And that is a phenomena that we're seeing across the board, not just in this case, but in a lot of cases where, where there are protests and where for various reasons, especially when there are protests regarding acquisition of land for mining or for industries, those are the areas where we are seeing very large-scale incarceration of people, and which is almost like a punishment. So detention itself is becoming a form of punishment rather than as a part of a trial.
Thank you for this wonderful documentary. Well, I think this is happening not only in India, but around the world in many places. I want to know about this justice project. If you could explain to us how successful and how are you conducting this? Okay.
See, this film's been made under this the rubric of this Justice Project. The Justice Project itself is a research and film project spread across South Asia. So what we were doing was we were looking at aspects of justice in the context of conflict in 5 South Asian countries, which is Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India. And the project comprises of about 15 research papers by lawyers, academics, and a few activists, but mostly academics and lawyers from all these 5 countries. So there are 15 research papers and 5 films. So this film is part of that project, and this is the film from India. So similarly, there are 4 other films. But almost everyone is working on a different thread, but looking at aspects of justice and conflict in the context of their own country or wherever they are situated. So that is the project.
Thank you. I understand that this started as a Gujarat model of modernization. Is that true? And is it this model what is being imposed in India by the new Prime Minister Modi?
You see, there's supposed to be something called the Gujarat Model, which no one really knows what it is, except that large tracts of lands get acquired for supposedly industries and which don't really come. Say, like even in the context of this Maruti factory, as you see what's happened with this factory, which they were planning to set up in Gujarat, is they've acquired a huge amount of land for the factory, and they wanted to be situated in Gujarat, and this particular factory was intended to be an entirely 100% export-oriented factory for cars to be manufactured here and shipped to Europe and other parts of the world. And so they acquired a whole lot of land, and they built a boundary wall, but the factory hasn't come up. And the factory hasn't come up essentially because there is no demand. Given the state of the economy in different parts of the world, there is no demand, so the factory has not appeared. So similarly, actually now more and more what's coming out of Gujarat is a certain, a model which essentially is showing that there is a certain very sharp urban growth, but actually a lot of, a lot of poverty and difficult circumstances for people in the rural areas, even in Gujarat, which, there was a huge amount of propaganda that how Gujarat is doing so well and things, which is now actually just being shattered because there are huge rural protests that are happening. So it's Gujarat model is something which, of course, our Prime Minister thinks is the great model for development, but it's not happening.
Thank you.
My name is Hardeep. I'm a student here, a grad student here in the history department. So I just wanted to note two things that I really liked about the film. And as I was sitting here, I realized it was very long, but then I thought why it was so long. And it's because you interweave a series of narratives, right? It's about the workers in the factory, but it's about the workers and their families. And it's also a story about an international company that has come into India, and it's a narrative about law and politics. And then the second thing that was very minor throughout the film, but I really enjoyed, was the way in which small aspects of technology came in. So this family says they can barely make ends meet, and then you transition to a radio that says we're celebrating the 65th day of independence, or the 65th year of independence in India. And it's really a question of what sort of independence is it if some people don't have enough to survive. But the one thing I saw, the narrative that I saw missing in the story was about this man who died and how his family wasn't included. I'm wondering, was that because you didn't have access to the family? They didn't want to be interviewed? And then the other thing I was sort of wondering about was the question of justice. It seems as if a lot of people in the film are talking about justice in the sense of ethical justice, right? Like these families understand the question of ethics and morality, but then there's also the question of legal justice, right? That doesn't necessarily map onto the moral or the ethical. And I'm wondering how involved they are in the legal process and in understanding the legal process.
Thank you. The narrative of this manager who died, it was a very difficult decision for me. One was, the medical legal records clearly show that he died of asphyxiation. Now, the prosecution, of course, is arguing that he was locked up in this room and he died, and they're charging the workers with murder. Now, the issue is that both sides were coming up with a certain narrative. The workers had, as it is there right in the beginning of the film, there was this theory that this is part of a conspiracy by the management. The management, of course, was accusing the workers of having set the place on fire and locking this guy up in this room. Now, there's no way that I can actually come to the truth as to what really happened. It's very difficult. And also the film, in a certain sense, also works on the idea that our courts, and is court procedure and the legal procedure really about truth? From either side, actually. I'm being fair. I'm not saying that either from the management or from the workers. Is it about truth or is it about something else? And in that sense, one can, the sort of it's almost a cliche, Derrida's statement that the courts deliver judgment and not justice this is an example of it. The court will ultimately give a judgment. But is that judgment about justice? And do the courts really serve the purpose of justice? Or is it that justice is about something else altogether? and the law and the courts become a site or a space where ideas of actually justice and injustice get generated, and which are followed up in other spaces rather than through legal procedure, is really the question before us. And in a certain sense, I'm hinting at that through this film. And yeah, was there anything else that? Yeah.
I had a question. I'm Kate Randall. I'm a reporter for the World Socialist website. We want to review the film. I had a question if you were aware of the present situation that auto workers in the U.S. are facing, because there's a big contract battle. The workers are engaged in a struggle against really a sellout being imposed by their own union. And word has it that today a number of the union locals have voted it down, and I wondered if you saw any relationship between this, what was portrayed in this film very powerfully about the lives of those workers and what U.S. auto workers are facing.
The fact is, it's across the globe. The fact that there is an informalization of work and contractualization of work and is a fact all over, in a sense. In this particular Maruti Suzuki case, of course, there are certain sort of global management, ways in which the company moves, but there are also very specific cultural issues involved here, and which is very, very contextual and very specific to India. So the production line and the management of the production line may have actually global standards, but the management of workers on those assembly line, that becomes very cultural and specific, and it has ways in which control mechanisms work, which may not be true for the US, but may be specifically true for India. Also, the issue here is that Maruti Suzuki workers and the other factory in the area, which is the Honda factory, the workers of Honda and Maruti workers are actually the elite of the workers. They're the highest paid workers. They're the workers who everyone looks up to. And so in that sense, the positioning of the Honda and the Suzuki workers in India is very, very different from all the entire ancillary which supports the Maruti Suzuki. So there are various other issues here involved, which are very, very specifically, it has a certain India specificity. But overall, yes, it's the same situation which is happening even in Germany with the auto workers. So there is a similar pattern that you see across the board.
A couple of quick questions. One is, how can somebody obtain this film? Is it available on a DVD? We sometimes have labor film festivals in the United States, and particularly in California, and I sort of think this would be a really powerful film for people to see at these things. So that was one thing that I wanted to ask you. And secondly, I wanted to just understand a little bit more of those fellows in the orange shirts who were in the community. While I must admit I've sometimes been involved cleaning up litter in India, so I see the value in it. There was that kind of bullying side to these guys. So, I just wanted to understand them. And my last question I wanted to ask, well, I saw today there was a headline that Murdoch had declared Modi the greatest prime minister in India's history. and I want to know, is there any media or press that does any good coverage of this issue, of this struggle, that you would say is a reliable place to try to turn to? We hear a lot about how entertainment has dominated many of the main newspapers in India, but we'd like to hear if there's some places we could go to get good information. So, sorry for three.
Not at all, not at all. Let me start from the last. Maruti Suzuki is always stories around Maruti Suzuki and strikes have always been reported, even in mainstream newspapers, because it's just symbolically, it's just a very, very important company, because it marks the opening of the Indian economy to corporations. So it's the first rail company which comes in a big way, and the Suzuki car is supposed to have revolutionized automobile industry in India. So it's symbolically a very, very important company. So anything that happens in Suzuki has a symbolic sort of value, so it is something that everyone sort of clued into. So there's always a reporting in the mainstream media about what happens in Maruti. However, it's the business papers have a certain slant and a certain angle with which they would look at the incidents. The more sort of the non-business media would, interestingly, at moments of crisis, the media a lot of times actually, newspapers as well as television, begins off on what you could largely say is the right note or a more liberal note. But within a day, you see the way in which stories change, and because there is immediately editorial pressure. Someone notices that some reporter has put in a story which is actually problematic, because Suzuki has a huge advertising control over media, and they fund the media in a major way through advertising. So you cannot take on Suzuki and you're going to lose a huge amount of revenue. So those are ways in which actually the mainstream media can be controlled and cajoled and arm twisted. But Maruti Suzuki, actually the struggle right from 2011 has garnered a lot of social media interest. So in terms of blogs and in terms of small little videos, there's been a lot of circulation of material around struggles in Maruti Suzuki through social media and alternative media. So it's interesting. You cannot find any other struggle or any other as much news about the other companies in India as much as you hear about Maruti Suzuki, even within social media. So that way, it's been much more sort of visible, the entire thing, and that's why, because also it's been iconic. It's really been iconic. These workers in 2011 to 2012, that entire those 2 years struggle was, and because the whole entire way in which they took up the contract workers case, workers who were regular and so-called permanent workers. This was the only example where in a big company like Suzuki, the regular workers took up the cause of the temporary workers and the contract workers, which was very radical, and which immediately affected and created a lot of ripples in the industrial areas, and which the national trade unions were not doing. This is the only independent small union which took up in. So in that way, there's a lot of really very, very significant things that have happened through this struggle of the Maruti workers, and so it's been visible, it's been reported about, but sadly not so much about a lot of other very important little things that keep happening in industrial areas. That there's complete silence about how I've just finished the film. I'm just in the process of setting up a certain distribution, and I've been introduced to some of the people who organize the labor festivals in the US. Someone called Chris or something, if I'm not mistaken, from DC. Maybe I'm getting the name wrong. But there's some global labor festival or something which I think. So it will soon, one issue DVDs is always that, about the color system, the PAL and NTSC. So I come from a PAL region. And so to get a good quality NTSC DVD is a slightly complicated process. So I'm just about resolving that. So it will be available it will be there, it will be distributed in the US also by someone. And most probably I'll do it, if not anyone else. But it will be available, and I'm happy to, anyway, pass on DVDs for any labor screenings anywhere. So. Oh yeah, of course, the orange, saffron, yes. You see, the thing is that, as was pointed out in the film, the land for this entire industrial township was taken from these 8-9 villages, their agricultural land. Now, some of those villages, about 4 to 5 villages, are now locked inside the industrial area. So in India, there is an old law by which the government can acquire agricultural land, but they cannot acquire the residence land of the village. So it's a very peculiar situation where the villages get landlocked. So because the government cannot acquire the land of the village where people are living. So unless there is a dam being built or something, and villages are going to be in an urban area. So there are these groups of villages which are now inside. So what actually I was also trying to hint at is that how control mechanisms are not just about the assembly line, but actually how workers are controlled outside the factory. And in the village is interesting sort of place because it's the land of the village which gets acquired at fairly low rates. And most of the families blow up that money and, they do either buy fancy vehicles or invest wrongly because the first time they're experiencing cash. And very soon what happens with these villages is their entire economy becomes dependent on rent. So they make these one-room tenements where 5 to 6 workers live in one room, and they are now entirely dependent on the earnings from that rent. And the company is very quick to recognize this and see that actually the villagers' interest lies now with the company, because if there's any disturbance, and the workers go away or the factory shut down, the villagers will be in a very bad shape. So the villagers and the company strike a certain kind of a relationship of controlling the workers. So it's like a proto-fascist little group, which and you can see that at a very small scale about the these moralisms about keeping your neighborhood clean, and of course there's nothing wrong in keeping it clean, but you start taking on the role of you start policing in a certain sense, which is the real problem. And of course you're controlling the workers, and then they intervene, even as they said that during the strike, where if they had if the company needs muscle men and if they need people to go and threaten the workers, these are the guys who come handy. And also it's interesting that one of the first campaigns that Modi launched when he became the Prime Minister was about cleaning India. Was this thing called Swachh Bharat, which is Clean India. And I thought it very sort of ironical that in this village also that was the big sort of movement which was on. Yeah, and also they're funded through this corporate social responsibility. So Maruti had built the wall around the cremation ground and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you answered that on the orange vested people, because it was it kind of popped up out of nowhere, but there was definitely a stench of fascistic attitudes towards the people, the way they were speaking about the villages and everything else, and you got all the hallmarks of a corporate vigilante squad, if you like, acting in behalf of the company. There's just a couple of points or questions I have. I think in relation to what you said earlier about the comparison, the peculiarly India topics and the more broad global questions. I thought the film did a very good job of shedding some insights on some particular issues that confront working people in India, in particular the relationship between town and country, the relationship between industrial workers and the peasantry. But I think there's also very many global lessons that come out of this film, and I think it should be given the broadest possible audience among workers in the US and throughout the world for that matter, but particularly in the US. I was struck when you said, these workers are the elite of the working class. I mean, that was also true of auto workers in America at one point historically, and precisely, I think it's precisely because of that they're in the forefront of the class struggle now, because obviously the capitalists want to drive down. They want to do away with that elite. They want to more generalise the labour costs. So I think again that's a very sort of broad lesson internationally.
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting that after 2012, after this 18th of July 2012 incident, the Maruti Suzuki, as was said in the film, about 543 regular workers were dismissed, and now increasingly, actually, at the factory, the more and more workers are now company casuals or temporary or apprentices. And they use the incident also to get rid of the regular workers.
I have one more question also.
There was an allusion made at some point in the film to kind of this encroachment of Gurgaon on, the city of Gurgaon itself onto sort of this village, encroaching on the pre-existing village. And my question is if you could talk about tensions between not just the villagers in the factory, but if there were sort of tensions between the pre-existing village and Gurgaon as sort of a symbol of the new India, right? This dream of development. Because I certainly saw a comparison between the kind of proto-fascist cleanup squad and similar kinds of initiatives that are done in gentrifying neighborhoods in the United States. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all.
There's one section which I had edited but was never made it to the film. I was looking actually at the maps of the township, right from the first map, when the township was imagined. And over the decade, how did this map keep changing? Which is a fascinating story actually, because the first map of the township, this industrial Manesar township, it's called IMT, is actually a fairly decent map, in the sense that it has about 12 acres of land for workers' group housing. It has land for workers' schools for workers' children. It has land for public hospital. It has land for public parks. And it has a lot of public utility areas marked out. What you see subsequently every 2 years is that all the public utility areas of this map keep disappearing and becoming commercial spaces. Now, what becomes very clear is that there is a way in which you actually stitch conflict into the map itself. So there's a certain inevitability to what we see. And that's what I was trying to point out through in the last sequence, that this is going to keep playing again and again. And also a lot of this actually goes against, even if you were to be just, I'm not even saying you have to be a radical state, even if you were just a liberal state, that itself would be a step forward. Right now the problem is that it's just a very, very vicious state, which strips people of the right to be human in any way. So you make workers stay in the worst of conditions, and you create those situations where, and then you start using that in really, really pathological ways of control. And everything is then about actually control, and how many different ways you can have different strategies of control. So as far as Gurgaon is concerned, that, if you start looking at actually the larger phenomena of Gurgaon, it is a robbery actually what's happened. If you look at just the maps and what is legal and what is illegal, most of Gurgaon is illegal by the standards of the laws of the state itself. You see, so let's not forget that in the case of India, if you even look at labor laws, simple. If you look at what is inscribed in law, the biggest defaulter of labor laws is the state itself. It's the biggest defaulter in terms of not following the labor laws that it itself has. So forget about where are the corporates going to follow it. So there is a way in which there is this whole conflict which is stitched into all of this. There is a complete predictability.
I had a question about the various sort of transitions of the union leadership that you reflected at different stages throughout the film, and I was particularly struck. There was a very powerful scene towards the end with relatives arguing for a work stoppage to put pressure on the company in relation to bail, which I can perfectly understand. After these people had been 2 years in prison, there was zero movement on the part of the courts or the company, and it seemed a perfectly reasonable demand to be making, and the new leadership, which was the lasting contention of leadership as far as in the course of the movie, in the course of the film, they seem to, each subsequent layer of leadership seem to be seeking more of an accommodation, a less confrontational role, to the point where towards the end of the film you have the defence lawyer sounds far more radical than the union itself. And, the defence lawyer is reminding the union leadership that their strength is in their movement, not in the various legal manoeuvres that they're trying to, out of necessity, trying to take. I just wonder, is that what you sort of witnessed? Is that what you were trying to bring out? Or?
Well, the film is a witness to, to all the sort of difficulties that all the provisional committee, the unions, and various other actors were facing. You see, it's a very, very difficult situation in the sense that, say, even if we were to look at this whole aspect of violence, and there have been various opinions on that. There's been one set of opinions which is very sort of openly set out that the way to understand this violence that happened in Maruti Suzuki is to look at it as a symbolic act of an attack on capitalist symbols. Now that argument has come actually from people who are not, or people who are part of the larger sort of working class movements in that area, but who are not centrally involved in this particular struggle or in this case. Now, the provisional committee is really caught between the rock and a hard place. If you own up to the violence, then you're condemning those 147 workers. You're making sure that there is no argument, you can't don't move. Where then does the defense go? So it's a very tricky situation. And it is because of that tricky situation that they are constantly negotiating all kinds of of very difficult union situations and political situations. So what is happening is that, see, what was interesting about the Maruti workers and the unionizing there was that it was one of those unions which was being given advice by a whole range of political parties, political opinions. So they were actually in touch between 2011 and 2012. There were a range of ideas. But they had a very, very interesting internal decision-making process. So they were hearing everyone. And I don't think there was any other union in India which got so much of actually thought and opinion and engagement from a whole range of left people, from a range of left positions. And they were constantly negotiating this from their own position, understanding, absorbing, rejecting, accepting certain positions and coming to their own decision. And some of the decisions that they took during the struggle were again very, very radical, against all opinion that was being given to them by the national trade unions. Say, for instance, the first strike when they occupied the factory. The standard Indian trade union tactics is to not occupy the factory but to set up a tent 200 feet away because that's the law. Now, these guys didn't listen to that and occupied the factory. Now, which, if you now start looking at it in the context of 3 years, that is the standard protest now. The first thing that the workers do in IMT area is to occupy the factory, or various factories. And it was actually sparked off by them, this idea. So in terms of, what I'm trying to say is that this particular moment for them has been very hard. They've been caught in a way that they are really, they're back to the wall. What do they do in a certain, these are workers who are having to run a political struggle while they are barred from coming anywhere near the factory. So to have a working class struggle in a union context outside the factory is a very peculiar situation. You're not running, so what you're doing is a different kind of a political struggle. So all those things are somewhere now, feeding into this kind of a situation. So they are, and there's been a huge pressure from the workers in the jail, the 147 workers, and obviously there's been pressure from the families, there is tension, because then, there, as which I show in the film also, that this woman is really, really, very she herself is under tremendous pressure, and so she's coming to the conclusion that the provisional committee is is on purpose not getting these guys out. So they are having to negotiate points of time, issues which are not directly even of political importance, but of actually managing all these different pressures. So it's, while I can see and I can recognize the ways in which, at points of time, you see them taking a reconciliatory note, because let's not forget, Manesar factory dismissed 2,500 workers. So what you have now in the factory are an entirely new generation of workers who were to begin with very scared. And these are new workers who have no memory also of what happened in 2011. So the older workers who were there in the factory, now it took them almost 2 years to somewhere, again start rebuilding. And now what has happened is that there is, for the first time, there is a certain coordination between, there are 4 Suzuki factories in that area. There's the Gurgaon main factory, the first factory, auto factory, then the Manesar auto factory, there is the Suzuki motorcycles and Suzuki powertrain, which makes diesel engines. Suzuki powertrain is inside the Manesar factory area. So it's a very difficult situation. That's what I'm trying to say. That it's very difficult to somewhere. I would not want to be in their shoes. That's for because how do you deal with this whole situation? And especially when you're accused of murder, 147. You can't just sacrifice them, and then you start doing all kinds of maneuvering and things to somewhere keep the possibilities of getting them out there. So a lot of what you see is coming out of actually strategy, part maneuvering, part being stuck in a very difficult space.
Rahul, can I just follow up on this question? Because I want to know, you've observed these processes over a long period of time, and my question is really, how do you read the ways in which processes of seeking or of getting closer to justice are understood by the characters in your film? So workers, families, the lawyers, activists, at times it seems that they actually have a certain degree of belief and faith in the courts, the legal system. At one point, I think the lawyer says, Mr. Huda, that if the judgment is done legally, they should be released. They're also kind of desperate. They also have to have this, put all these resources and energy into the courts because they have to try to get these workers out of these entanglements, out of jail. But you also see this awareness of the distortion of this whole system. And this discussion of extra-legal processes, work stoppage, collectivity beyond Maruti, as being important to the outcome of the legal struggle. So I guess my question really is, how do you see this sort of, the perceptions of these processes? Because they are spending a lot of energy to deal with the court aspect. And then there's all these other things too. So can you tell us a bit about that?
See, the workers who came to the fore after the incident, after the 147 workers being in jail, meant the entire top leadership plus the second layer of leadership was in jail. So the workers who then took on and became the provisional committee and the other workers who were around them, who were part of those who were being dismissed. Now these were workers who were not the direct union leaders. All right, they were associated with the union leadership. They had been part of the struggles from 2011. They had observed what had happened. And so for them, this last 2-year process of 2 and now almost 3 years after the incident has been actually not a process of learning to unionize, learning to intervene on assembly lines, learning to deal with the management, but it's actually about learning to deal with the state. Which is a very different sort of political process that they're involved in. They have nothing to do with the management. They don't meet. The management is not interested in them. So what is happening with them is a politicization process which is very different from the politicization that happens in struggles inside factories. So their first real sort of, political lesson for them, which they are, which they will constantly tell you, is how they have no faith in the courts. So you see, now that's what I was trying to say right in the beginning, that it's a very strange situation where you're fighting a court case You don't think that the court is about justice, but yet you have to give it that importance, that struggle, that seriousness, that engagement, Now, so what is happening is there is a certain kind of a radicalization of an understanding of your own self, your own proletarian self, not vis-a-vis production but vis-a-vis the state, for this entire new leadership which is emerged, which is a very different kind of a radicalization, and it is, and when it comes to justice, then it is not that the courts actually represent somewhere, or the legal procedures represent somewhere the movement or even the ability to achieve justice, but actually become the reason for further demands for justice and a certain realization that actually this is a completely unjust system that we are up against. So it becomes more a space and a site where you understand injustice rather than you start somewhere encountering justice. So it is actually the complete opposite what's happening. And that's, I think, for them, that occupation.
Please
Pleasure.
join me and thank you, Rahul Roy.